Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I want to take a look at mission design in Star Citizen and why so much new content depends on combat. Star Citizen is supposed to have gameplay for everyone, but looking at the latest series of dynamic events we can see that they lean heavily into combat even though they have some non-combat elements. So in the grand scheme of Star Citizen, is combat becoming the majority of gameplay, or is there a deeper meaning behind this content direction? As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons and channel members for their support of the channel and everything else I do. So is combat really everywhere in Star Citizen? Well, yes and no. I think there are two ways to look at it. We can look at the available content and we can look at player perception. If you look at the available content, I would say there is pretty solid balance of combat and non-combat gameplay. But there are two caveats. First, the mission system is not fully refactored. This means that a lot of content from the previous versions is missing. For example, delivery missions or investigation missions. All of this will gradually be added back to the game. And second, most non-combat gameplay revolves around industrial gameplay loops, most of which require a special ship to take part in, especially mining and salvage and to some extent hauling as well, which effectively creates a higher barrier of entry compared to low-level bounty missions or bunker missions, which you can do in a starter ship. But at the same time, you can take your starter ship to a cave and hand mine, which has a pretty low barrier of entry as well. So from a content perspective, I think there is a wide range of gameplay options available, assuming all missions are added back at some point. Also assuming that everything works, and finally assuming that you have the right ship. Now, the player perception is a bit more complicated. One of the major issues with the mission system was that it would occasionally spawn a combat mission at the same location as a non-combat mission at the same time. So you could be recovering cargo from an abandoned crash site and suddenly find yourself under fire from NPCs that spawned out of nowhere. Or you would be delivering a box to an outpost and an NPC bounty would spawn right above you and destroy your ship, leaving you stranded. Especially in Stanton, where outposts don't have any turrets, this was a major problem. But now in 4.0, it seems like bounties spawn further away from outposts, so maybe that will mitigate the issue. But in general, I think we have enough points of interest to make mission overlap pretty rare, especially for missions that have a conflicting risk rating. So it should be okay for hauling missions to spawn at the same location, but maybe not at the same location as an active bounty. However, mission overlap can create player interaction with other players or NPCs, which creates emergent gameplay opportunities, which CIG like, as well as randomized risk. And risk is a big factor when it comes to gameplay in Star Citizen. On the other hand, if your activity is interrupted by this emergent gameplay that's not what you want to do or are not equipped to do, that's just an interruption and you're not gaining any gameplay, you're actually losing gameplay. Think of an alternate scenario. Imagine you go do a bunker mission, but you find that the door is blocked by a container that spawned there or someone left there. You don't have a tractor beam on you, so you can't move it and complete your mission. It's not the best example, but you get the point. But that brings the question of whether non-combat missions should be completely safe. And the answer is depends. If you're doing a delivery in Terra, it should be very safe. In Stanton, you should have missions with varied amounts of risk, and in Pyro, it's a free-for-all. But the mission system should be aware of this and somehow tell the player if their delivery mission is going to take them to an unsafe area or if there's a chance of an encounter. I actually like the way Elite Dangerous does this. Every mission has a risk level, and based on that risk level, you have a chance of a random encounter. You can still encounter NPCs that are already in the area or other players. But unless you're in a specifically dangerous area or encounter an enemy faction, the chances of that interaction being hostile are fairly low. So a part of the player perception issue comes from the mission system being incomplete. Eventually this might or might not get fixed. Ideally, mission risk rating, mission types available, and random encounters would be covered by Quanta, but we don't know what's going on with that. The other part of player perception is the content and messaging we've been getting from CIG over the past year. If you look at new content, you will see that a lot of it is majority combat focused. Even the supposed cargo missions for events had combat in them, and I suppose that's making some players feel a bit left out of new content, which is fair but ultimately their choice, which is kind of the point of Star Citizen. So why would CIG focus more on combat over the last year? There are actually a few reasons, but first let me take a brief pause to pay some bills. Most of you watching are not subscribed, so go on and click that button and let the algorithm know that you like my channel. Also, don't forget to check out the latest episode of the Comm Relay podcast and my community apps, the Hauler and the Armory. Now let's get back to the video. So why would CIG focus more on combat? I think the obvious answer is because Pyro was being worked on, and Pyro being a lawless system and given the lack of proper reputation is basically an open battlefield. So it makes sense for CIG to introduce new combat focused content to offer some variety to the players. At the same time, Pyro also offers missions like salvage or cargo hauling, which are not combat based, but you run the added risk of an encounter which is compensated for with a higher payout. Also, I feel like industrial gameplay loops and other non-combat missions are in a pretty good place right now, or at least they will be once they are added back to the game. Obviously, there are some balancing issues. For example, the price of salvage contracts versus the amount of resources recovered, or the size and composition of hauling missions. But these are things that can be easily configured by CIG. On the other hand, according to a lot of players, combat leaves a lot to be desired. Bunker missions have been mostly untouched since they were introduced, besides the addition of spawn closets. The AI behavior is inconsistent, and I generally feel like we lost a lot of variety before 4.0. For example, cave bounty missions were amazing. I hope they make a comeback at some point as well, especially with the new cave types. And that brings us to the other reason. From a developer standpoint, given the current state of Star Citizen, in which new content needs to be added on a regular basis to keep the community happy, combat is easy. Let's take a step back and think about why. Implementing new missions is difficult. First, you need to have the underlying missions framework in place. So, a way to generate new missions, figure out which missions does a player have access to and where, find a suitable location, and track progress. Then you need to have the systems required to create the objectives. That could be a delivery kiosk, or a cargo elevator, or a counter of how many enemies are left. And all of these have their own underlying dependencies. For example, the cargo system or spawn closets. If any of these dependencies break for any reason, the mission stops working. Now, chances are that 4.0 and server meshing broke a ton of those dependencies. And until those are fixed, the mission teams are going to have a very limited set of tools and content to build missions out of. So, what is the easiest way to add content without too many dependencies? Simple. You put something valuable somewhere, tell the players where it is, and let them fight over it. Which is the base principle of contested zones or even Jump Town. And this process is very easy to repeat and build upon, which is how we got the Fight for Pyro event. So, is this a bad thing? No, CIG are working with what they have. And it's actually pretty great that they're managing to make things even with how many systems are not yet converted to work with server meshing. And I think we will see a lot of new missions and content added in the second half of 2025 after 4.0 is stabilized. I am actually very interested in seeing how CIG manage their new content-driven approach to releases. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? Are CIG too focused on combat? Will they be able to deliver new mission content this year? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.